The Untold Files.
December 1922, Harlem, New York. A young woman walked into a storefront on 139th Street carrying $10,000 in cash. She was 25 years old. She stood 5 feet 11 inches tall. She spoke French and English fluently. She dressed in expensive clothes and carried herself with the confidence of royalty. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair, but in Harlem everyone called her Queenie, or Madame St. Clair, or simply the Queen. And she was about to build an empire that would change Harlem forever. Stephanie St. Clair. Clair was born on December 24, 1897, in Martinique, French West Indies, though some sources say Guadeloupe. She arrived in New York in 1912 at age 14, alone, with nothing but her intelligence, her education, and her determination. She worked as a domestic servant in Canada for 5 years, saving every penny. When she returned to Harlem in 1917, she had enough money to invest in herself, and by 1922 she had $10,000, a fortune at the time, and a plan. The plan was simple but revolutionary: create a gambling system specifically designed for Harlem's black community. The numbers racket, also called policy banking, was a lottery where players bet small amounts, pennies, nickels, dimes on a 3-digit number drawn daily. If your number hit, you won big. For poor black families locked out of white banks and white businesses, the numbers game became a parallel economy. It was hope, it was opportunity, and it was community. St. Clair understood this better than anyone. She didn't just want to run a gambling operation, she wanted to build an institution. So she used her $10,000 to start her own policy bank. She hired runners to collect bets. She hired accountants to track the numbers. She hired enforcers to protect her operation. And she insisted on one rule above all: honesty. If a player won, they got paid. Every time. No excuses, no cheating. That reputation for fairness made Stephanie St. Clair rich. By 1925, St. Clair controlled a network of over 24 policy operations across Harlem. She employed hundreds of people: runners, collectors, enforcers, accountants. She made millions of dollars annually, and she invested that money back into the community. She donated to churches. She funded scholarships for black students. She bailed people out of jail. She paid rent for families facing eviction. She understood that power wasn't just about money, it was about respect. And in Harlem, Stephanie St. Clair commanded absolute respect. Men twice her size stepped aside when she walked down the street. Cops who harassed other black business owners left her alone, or learned to regret it when she published their names and badge numbers in the Amsterdam News, accusing them of corruption. Rival gangsters who tried to muscle in on her territory found themselves facing not just her enforcers, but the wrath of an entire community that saw her as their protector. Among those enforcers was a young man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Everyone called him Bumpy because of a large bump on the back of his head from a childhood injury. Bumpy was from South Carolina. He had come to Harlem in the 1920s as a teenager, drawn by the promise of the Harlem Renaissance. But instead of becoming an artist or a musician, Bumpy became a criminal. He was smart, ruthless, loyal, and Stephanie St. Clair saw potential in him. She hired him in 1928 as one of her top enforcers. Bumpy's job was simple: protect St. Clair's operations from rival gangs, corrupt cops, and anyone else who threatened her empire. And Bumpy was very good at his job. By 1930, Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson were the most powerful criminal partnership in Harlem. She was the brains, he was the muscle. Together they controlled the numbers racket. Together they employed thousands of people. Together they were untouchable. But that was about to change, because in 1930, a white mobster from the Bronx, named Arthur Fliegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, decided he wanted Harlem for himself. Prohibition was ending. The Italian Mafia, which had made billions from bootlegging alcohol, was looking for new sources of income, and they saw Harlem's numbers racket generating millions of dollars annually. all controlled by black operators like Stephanie St. Clair. Dutch Schultz, one of the most violent mobsters in New York, was sent by the Mafia to take over Harlem. Schultz didn't ask permission. He didn't negotiate. He simply declared that all policy bankers in Harlem would now pay him tribute 50% of their profits or face the consequences. Most black policy bankers, terrified of Schultz's reputation for extreme violence, immediately surrendered. They handed over their operations. They paid the tribute. They bowed down. But Stephanie St. Clair refused. When Schultz sent emissaries to demand her submission, St. Clair sent them back with a message. Tell Dutch Schultz that I don't work for white men. I work for myself, and if he wants Harlem, he'll have to take it from me. Schultz, enraged by the defiance of a black woman, declared war. And it was brutal. Between 1931 and 1935, the Harlem Numbers War claimed more than 40 lives. Schultz's men bombed St. Clair's policy banks. They murdered her runners. They threatened her family. Saint murdered her family. Clair fought back with everything she had. Bumpy Johnson and her other enforcers retaliated against Schultz's men. They ambushed his collectors. They destroyed his operations. They sent a message Harlem would not submit. St. Clair also fought on another front, the media. She took out full-page advertisements in the Amsterdam News, publicly accusing Schultz of extortion, murder, and racism. She named corrupt NYPD officers who were taking bribes from Schultz. She testified before a police commission, providing detailed evidence of corruption. Several officers were fired as a result. St. Clair's strategy was brilliant. She couldn't outgun Schultz, but she could expose him. By 1934, the war had reached a stalemate. Schultz controlled parts of Harlem, but St. Clair still held her core territory. Both sides had lost men. Both sides were exhausted. And then, in 1935, something happened that changed everything. Schultz, facing federal tax evasion charges brought by prosecutor Thomas Dewey, decided to assassinate Dewey. It was a desperate move, and it violated the Mafia's most sacred rule: never kill a prosecutor, because it brings too much heat. Lucky Luciano, the head of the Mafia Commission, refused to authorize the hit. When Schultz threatened to go ahead anyway, Luciano made a decision. Dutch Schultz had to die. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was eating dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, when two hitmen walked in. They shot Schultz and 3 of his associates. Schultz was gut-shot. He lingered for almost 24 hours, delirious and rambling, before dying on October 24th. As Dutch Schultz lay dying in the hospital, he received a telegram. It read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." It was signed, Stephanie St. Clair. The telegram became legendary. It was Queenie's final statement to the man who had tried to destroy her. It was her victory lap. It was proof that she had outlasted him. But the victory was bittersweet, because by 1935, Stephanie St. Clair understood something that would break her heart. Even with Schultz dead, she couldn't win. The Italian Mafia, now led by Lucky Luciano, still controlled most of Harlem. Corrupt cops still demanded bribes, and the violence had taken its toll on her operation and her spirit. St. Clair was tired. She was in her late 30s. She had been fighting for over a decade, and she knew that if she continued, she would either end up dead or in prison. So in late 1935, Stephanie St. Clair made the most difficult decision of her life. She called Bumpy Johnson to her apartment, and she handed him her entire empire. Late 1935. Stephanie St. Clair's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson sat across from the woman who had given him his start, who had taught him how power worked, who had shown him that intelligence mattered more than violence, and now she was about to give him everything she had built. "Bumpy," St. Clair said, her voice calm but tired, "I'm done. I can't fight anymore. Schultz is dead, but Luciano is smarter and more powerful. The police are more corrupt than ever, and I'm exhausted. I've been fighting this war for 5 years. I've lost friends, I've lost money, and I've lost the will to keep going. Bumpy listened in silence. Then St. Clair continued, I'm handing my operations to you, all of them. The policy banks, the runners, the collectors, the protection money, everything. You'll negotiate with Luciano. You'll make peace with the Italians. And you'll run Harlem the way it should be run, with intelligence, discipline, and respect for the community. Bumpy Johnson was 30 years old. He had been St. Clair's enforcer for 7 years. He knew her operation inside and out, but taking over was a massive responsibility. It meant inheriting not just her wealth and power, but also her enemies, her debts, and her legacy. Bumpy looked at St. Clair and said, Why me? You have other people, people who've been with you longer. St. Clair smiled. Because you're the smartest, and you're the most ruthless when you need to be. But more importantly, you care about Harlem. You're not doing this just for money. You're doing it because you believe that black people deserve to control their own destinies. That's why I'm giving this to you. Bumpy nodded slowly. What will you do? St. Clair leaned back in her chair. I'm going to become legitimate. I'm going to focus on civil rights. I'm going to use my money and my voice to fight for black people in ways that don't involve breaking the law. And I'm going to live long enough to see you succeed. The transfer happened quietly over the next few months. St. Clair introduced Bumpy to her key lieutenants. She walked him through the financial records. She gave him the names of every cop on the payroll, every rival to watch out for, every ally who could be trusted. And then, in early 1936, Stephanie St. Clair officially retired from the numbers game. She was 38 years old. She had built an empire, she had fought a war, and she had survived. Most importantly, she had ensured that Harlem's numbers racket remained in black hands, because by giving the operation to Bumpy Johnson, she had passed the crown to the one man she believed could protect it, and she was right. Bumpy Johnson took St. Clair's empire and expanded it. He negotiated with Lucky Luciano, agreeing to pay a 10% tribute to the Italian Mafia in exchange for protection and peace. It was a compromise, St. Peace. Clair had refused, but Bumpy understood that sometimes survival required bending, not breaking. With that peace in place, Bumpy consolidated control over Harlem's numbers racket. By the early 1940s, he controlled approximately 60% of the policy banks in Harlem. He employed hundreds of people. He generated millions of dollars annually. And he maintained St. Clair's reputation for honesty. If you won, you got paid. But while Bumpy Johnson was building his empire, Stephanie St. Clair was building something else, a legacy of activism. In 1936, she married Sufi Abdul Hamid, a controversial civil rights activist and leader of a black nationalist group. Hamid was charismatic, flamboyant, and deeply controversial. He was known for organizing boycotts of white-owned businesses that refused to hire black workers. But he was also accused of anti-Semitism and self-aggrandizement. Their marriage was passionate but turbulent. By 1938, the relationship had deteriorated. On January 12, 1938, Stephanie St. Clair shot Hamid during a heated argument over his affair with another woman. She was arrested, tried, and convicted of assault. The trial was sensational. St. Clair's lawyer exposed Hamid's real name, Eugene Brown, and revealed that he was running a con, pretending to be descended from Egyptian royalty. The jury convicted St. Clair anyway, and she was sentenced to 2 to 10 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. St. Clair served nearly 3 years in prison before being released in 1941. When she returned to Harlem, she was 53 years old, and she was done with violence. She focused entirely on civil rights activism. She wrote letters to newspapers denouncing police brutality and discrimination. She donated money to black organizations. She spoke at community meetings advocating for economic empowerment and political representation, and she maintained a quiet friendship with Bumpy Johnson, who continued to seek her advice on Harlem matters. In the 1960s, after Bumpy's release from Alcatraz, he even lived with St. Clair for a time, writing poetry and reflecting on his life. The two had an unspoken bond. She had given him everything, and he had protected what she built. Stephanie St. Clair died in December 1969, just days before her 72nd birthday. She died wealthy, thanks to smart investments made during her criminal years. She died free, having never returned to a life of crime. And she died knowing that Harlem's numbers racket, the empire she had built, had remained in black hands for decades. Her death went largely unnoticed. No major newspaper ran an obituary. No public memorial was held. But in Harlem, the old-timers remembered. They remembered Queenie. They remembered the woman who had stood up to Dutch Schultz. They remembered the woman who had refused to bow down to the white mob. They remembered the woman who had handed her empire to Bumpy Johnson and changed Harlem forever. So why did Stephanie St. Clair hand her entire empire to Bumpy Johnson? The simple answer is exhaustion. She was tired of fighting, tired of violence, tired of looking over her shoulder. But the deeper answer is more profound. St. Mauro, Claire understood something that few people in her position ever grasp. Power is temporary. Empires rise and fall, and the only way to ensure that her life's work would continue was to pass it to someone she trusted, someone who shared her values, someone who understood that the numbers racket wasn't just about money, it was about community empowerment. Bumpy Johnson was that person. And St. Clair's decision to hand her empire to him changed Harlem in three fundamental ways. First, it kept Harlem's numbers racket in black hands. If St. Clair had simply retired without a successor, the Italian Mafia would have taken over completely. Harlem would have become just another territory controlled by white mobsters, with profits flowing out of the community. But by giving the operation to Bumpy, St. Clair ensured that the money stayed in Harlem, that black families continued to have jobs, that black children continued to receive scholarships funded by numbers profits, that black churches and community organizations continued to receive donations. The numbers racket, illegal as it was, became a lifeline for thousands of Harlem residents during the Great Depression and beyond. Second, St. Clair's decision established a model of black leadership in organized crime. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster, he was a strategist. He was a community protector. He was a man who commanded respect not just through violence, but through intelligence and principle. And that model influenced generations of black leaders in Harlem, both criminal and legitimate. People saw that it was possible to operate in a white-dominated world without surrendering your identity or your power. That lesson, taught by St. Clair and embodied by Bumpy Johnson, resonated far beyond the numbers game. Third, and perhaps most importantly, St. Clair's decision gave Harlem a sense of continuity. For decades, the black community had watched white people take their wealth, their property, their opportunities. But in the numbers game, they saw something different. A black woman building an empire and then passing it to a black man who would protect it. That continuity mattered. It gave people hope. It showed that black people could build institutions that lasted, that they could create their own economies, that they could control their own destinies. And that sense of empowerment, more than any amount of money, was Stephanie St. Clair's greatest gift to Harlem. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, at age 62. He collapsed at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, the victim of a heart attack. He had ruled Harlem for over 3 decades, maintaining the empire that Stephanie St. Clair had given him. When he died, thousands of people attended his funeral. They mourned not just a gangster, but a protector, a leader, a symbol of black pride and power. Stephanie St. Clair died 18 months later, in December 1969. The two people who had defined Harlem's underworld for 40 years were gone within 2 years of each other. And with their deaths, an era ended. The numbers racket in Harlem began to decline in the 1970s as state-run lotteries were legalized, offering the same service with legal protection. The community institutions that had been funded by numbers profits faded. The parallel economy that St. Clair had created was absorbed into the mainstream. But the legend remained. Today, more than 50 years after her death, Stephanie St. Clair is remembered as a trailblazer, a woman who defied every expectation placed on her, a black immigrant who built a $1 million empire in a city that tried to destroy her, a gangster who became an activist, a queen who passed her crown to a king, and Bumpy Johnson is remembered as the man who honored her legacy, who protected what she built, who proved that her faith in him was not misplaced. Together, St. T, Clair and Johnson demonstrated something powerful, that leadership is about more than holding power. It's about knowing when to pass that power to the next generation. It's about trusting someone else to carry forward the work you started. It's about building something that lasts beyond your lifetime. In 1997, the film Hoodlum dramatized the story of Stephanie St. Rode, Clair and her war with Dutch Schultz. Actress Cicely Tyson portrayed St. Clair with dignity and strength, introducing a new generation to the Queen of Harlem. In 2019, the television series Godfather of Harlem depicted the relationship between St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson. Though it took significant creative liberties, these portrayals, while imperfect, kept the story alive. They reminded people that before there was Frank Lucas, before there was Nicky Barnes, before there were the drug kingpins of the 1970s and 80s, there was Stephanie St. Clair, and there was Bumpy Johnson. And together they built an empire that changed Harlem forever. The reason Stephanie St. Clair handed her empire to Bumpy Johnson wasn't just personal, it was political. It was a statement that black people could build institutions, that they could pass wealth and power to the next generation, that they could control their own communities, and in a city and a country that was determined to keep black people powerless, that statement mattered. It still matters today. Because the story of Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson isn't just about crime. It's about resistance. It's about self-determination. It's about the refusal to bow down. And it's about the understanding that true power isn't measured by how much you can take, but by what you can build and who you can lift up. Stephanie St. Clair understood that, and when she handed her empire to Bumpy Johnson, she changed Harlem forever.